Hello everyone. Thanks for joining me again. This is the last of the series of 3 lectures. The first one was on general ideas about vocabulary and why it's important. Then I talked about our particular intervention and the principles and how you put the principles into practice. And now finally, what I'm going to talk about today is how effective is this vocabulary intervention? So we'll take a look at some of the research that we've done. I'll try and make it as interesting as possible and as accessible as possible. And as usual, I'll remind you that the whole vocabulary project was funded by the Center on Literacy and Deafness and the Institute of Educational Sciences in the US. I'm hoping that you'll see the effectiveness that we have of this particular intervention. Tell you a little bit about the overall research, and then I'm going to simply select one of the studies to show you the detailed results. We actually have completed 3 single subject studies. Single subject studies are experimental studies where each individual is the unit that you look at. These studies have been across 13 deaf and hard of hearing children in grades K through 2. We've worked with children who have a range of hearing loss from moderate to profound. Children have used spoken language, sign language, and others have used both spoken and sign language. And as I said, I am just going to present the results from one specific study. You can look for the others in our publications when they come out. So in this particular study, we are working with 5 children. Their hearing loss is mostly moderate to profound, and we have 2 of them were implant users and 3 of them were hearing aid users. You could see that their vocabulary scores are really low. So the mean score is 74. When you think that the standard score, an average standard score is 100, one standard deviation below is 85. These children are almost 1.5 standard deviations below, so they really have low vocabulary. Their reading comprehension score is also 1 standard deviation below. You might wonder why reading comprehension is higher than vocabulary. It's because they are taking a very low-level test, the requirements, a lot of pictures and so on. They're not really reading very well, even though their comprehension scores are a little higher than their vocabulary scores. As you could see, they're 1st and 2nd graders. We have both boys and girls, and most of the kids are using spoken English. Design and procedures, which is the standard way to begin. It's a single subject, multiple baseline design. This is where you stagger the intervention across the subjects. So we take a baseline on each child as we begin. Then we introduce the intervention with child 1, and once we see a change, we then introduce the intervention in a staggered fashion with child 2, and then child 3, and so on. What you want to see is that the intervention changes children's learning, but only at the time of intervention, right? So that is how we know that it's the intervention that results in vocabulary learning. And I'll point that out across the graphs. We work with the children 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week. And we had a total of 7 sessions, which includes both the teaching sessions as well as the assessment sessions. So these are our assessment measures. We assess the target words in isolation. We basically use the picture prompt. We put the picture in front of the child and ask them for a word. And so the kids would give the word. We do this at both baseline and during the intervention, and then during a follow-up to see if children retain the vocabulary. But then we also wanted to make sure that the kids are able to use the words not just by rote in response to a picture cue, but also use it when talking about the topic. So we gave them one of the books that we read to them, and we asked them to do a book walk. That is, just look at the pictures and tell us about the topic. And in the beginning, we reminded them, we said, you know, you used a lot of new words recently. You learned some new words. If you can, use the words while you're talking to us about the book. And so just a general, very general prompt in the beginning, and then we let them go. And then we counted how many of the new words they used and whether they were used appropriately while talking about the topic. So you'll remember that I had talked about how we want children to be able to use words to talk about new words. So we also assessed their ability to define the words. We gave them a prompt and said, tell me about the new word, and they would give us their version of the definition or an explanation of the word, and we developed a 4-point rating scale for these definitions or explanations, and I will show you the results from all of that. So here are our results. First, the important thing to always look at is what we call treatment integrity. How well did we actually conduct the intervention? And so these bars show the treatment integrity for each piece of the intervention. The FATS mapping is the first bar, and that what it says is that the teacher conducted the intervention with 96% integrity. We made a list of all of the pieces, of all of the components of the FATS mapping, and we looked to see if the teachers actually did that. Now, these are very high treatment integrity figures, which is to be expected because the teachers are Center for Literacy and Deafness teachers. They are whom we call research teachers. They were part of the development of the intervention. These are not just regular classroom teachers, so we would expect treatment integrity to be very high. And as you can see, it ranges from 93 to 100%. 93% is the lowest, and it's for conversation. And if you will remember, I told you that conversation is one of the more difficult areas to conduct. And so you could see we have the lowest treatment integrity for conversation, even though it's still quite high. 93% is very acceptable. So here are the results. And the way to read this is the first area to the left of the dotted line is the baseline for each child. And you could see how the baseline and the intervention is staggered. So you have 3 baseline points for child 1, and then you have a slightly longer baseline for child 2, and a slightly longer baseline for child 3, and children 4 and 5 are on the next slide. The way to look at this is you could see at baseline, the children did not know the words. So this is the results for words, for the words in isolation. And the graph, the vertical axis, goes from 0 to 8 because we had targeted 8 words. And at baseline, child 1 knew none of the new words. After the intervention, we assessed after every second intervention session. So we assessed at about session 2, session 4 or 5, and then session 6. And that's that middle column. And you can see how many words that child learned almost immediately. So after 2 sessions had learned 6 new words, and by the end of the intervention had learned 8 new words. 2 weeks later, we assessed again to make sure that children retained the words. And you could see that child 1, the one at the top of the graph, maintained all 8 words that she had learned. The thing to look at is the pattern for each successive child, and you could see that the pattern is the same. They did not know the words at baseline, which is not surprising because we chose words that they did not know. And that after the first session, they learned a few words, sometimes 2 words, sometimes 4 words. But by the end of the intervention, most of them have learned 8 words, some of them have learned 5 words. They are able to maintain the words that they have learned. That is, 2 weeks later, they're able to retain the words. Here are the results for the other 2 children. You can see for them the baselines are rather long. They were a little exasperated at being assessed on the same words when they did not know them, but in the interest of good research, they helped us. But you could see how rapid the word learning is. So in 2 sessions, they've learned about 2 to 3 words, but by session 7, they've almost all of them learned 7 or 8 words. This slide we think is very exciting because it's one thing to provide the words in isolation in response to a picture cue. These are the words that children used during the book walk, right, when they are using it in their spontaneous language. So you could see that we did a book walk at the beginning of the intervention and at the end. So during baseline and then at the last session of the intervention. And this presents the data for each child. So for example, the child 120023 is the child's number. At pre-intervention did not use any of the new words, but at post-intervention used 6 new words of the 8 new words spontaneously when talking about the topic. This is without any prompt except, as I said before, where we said, oh, try to use the new words you've learned. The fewest new words were 3, but most of the children are using 4 of the new words that they've learned during the spontaneous talk about the book. We also looked at the definition scores, and again, you can see that their definition scores are taken at baseline, and then at the last intervention session, and then at the maintenance session, which is approximately 2 weeks after the intervention ceased. And you could see how the definition scores for each child increased at the end of the intervention and were maintained 2 weeks later. So this we also think is very exciting because it's telling us that the children have a rather deep knowledge of the words. They know what these words mean and they are able to talk about them. Did they give us the dictionary definitions? No. We didn't want the dictionary definitions. We didn't want them to give us the rote-learned definitions. We want them to tell us something about the words, and that's why we have the scoring system. So if I'm concluding on the research, I would say that our data show that all children are able to learn the target vocabulary, and this we saw really across all 3 studies. They were all able to increase their ability to provide explanations and/or definitions of the target vocabulary, and they used 3 to 4 of the new words at least in spontaneous connected language. So we think these are very positive results. I'm going to just share with you a few resources that you can use. If you're looking for child-friendly definitions to create your own units, there are some websites there that you can use. And here are some key readings that you might find very useful. I'm going to now take the opportunity to just recap the takeaway messages for the series of lectures. One is that vocabulary can be caught, but we should also be teaching it, especially for deaf and hard of hearing children who often are very low in their vocabulary scores, that their overall lexicon can be rather small, and this is going to affect their reading comprehension. The second message is that vocabulary teaching actually takes some planning. If you're only going to do it on the fly, you're going to leave children with word recognition, but not the ability to use the words, and especially not the ability to use the words in their connected, spontaneous language. Explicit instruction in vocabulary actually has positive outcomes, but both explicit and in-context vocabulary instruction are necessary for real vocabulary learning, for in-depth vocabulary learning. Successful teaching, we think, involves selecting the appropriate words, developing child-friendly definitions, engaging in direct instruction like fast mapping, interactive book reading with books that include target words to put the words into a context for the children, and activities that allow children to use the target words. I cannot emphasize this enough. It is not sufficient for teachers to use the words over and over again. Children have to be able to use the words over and over again, to express them in various contexts and in various ways. So I hope that you will go out and develop your own units of vocabulary instruction to try out some of these strategies and principles, and I hope you'll be very successful. Thank you.